Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, cardinals and card gamers, welcome to Clarifying Catholicism. You're watching part 7 of my series, Vatican II's Theology of Other Religions, Discontinuity or Reform. Most of this information is drawn from my master's thesis, which you can find in the description. To see the rest of the videos in the series, check the playlist in the description as well. Without further ado, on to the show. In previous episodes, we examined both Cantate Domino and Lumen Gentium, according to the criteria we outlined in episode 2. Today, we will directly compare the councils to see if there's any discontinuity between them. Remember, the two documents we are comparing are Cantate Domino from the Council of Florence and Lumen Gentium from the Second Vatican Council. As episode 2 proposed, Lumen Gentium can only be considered discontinuous if it meets every single one of the following criteria. Both documents must come from a source capable of rendering infallible statements, which would be a council or a pope. They must be categorized as infallibly binding statements. They must have the same intentions, rely on similar epistemological and historical assumptions, have the same scope they are addressed to. They must be both received into the Church, and they must be in line with preceding doctrines. Although episode 2 proposed that discrepancies in just one of these criteria is enough to disprove discontinuity, analyzing each criterion can yield a more accurate conclusion, since some of them are more conclusive than others. Let's begin. Number 1. Source. Do they both come from a council or pope? At face value, both documents, having been approved of and promulgated by councils, appear to have identical sources. However, our historical reviews from episodes 3 and 4 reveal that within the broader genre of conciliar documents, the two statements have very different origins. Given Florence's disjointed nature, which was impacted by constantly changing locations and cycling through delegations over the course of 18 years, many of its documents were written by a revolving door of theologians with varying degrees of authority. As Lawrence King emphasizes, Cantate Domino, though approved by the council, was not itself drafted by council fathers. Rather, it came from a group of theologians who were asked to hastily, and as a result rather sloppily, summarize Western theology. Lumen Gentium, on the other hand, was the product of years of planning, research, and debate between a stable group of conciliar authorities who were constantly involved in the drafting and approval of each document. Vatican II was quite diverse in representation. It involved both ecclesial authorities and lay theologians, though only the former could vote on the approval of final documents. Furthermore, Lumen Gentium's composition and approval was not restricted to a handful of bishops from a certain region. Rather, it involved thousands of bishops representing as close to a consensus as the Church has ever seen before. While strictly speaking, both documents were conciliar, but the different role authority figures played in their respective documents seems to be too significant to overlook. Thus, according to the criterion of source, discontinuity seems unlikely, though this could be disputed. Number 2. Type. Are they both considered to have been infallibly defined? Both Cantate Domino and Lumen Gentium exhibit features of a widespread theological opinion, albeit for different reasons. Whereas the authorship of Cantate Domino, which consisted of theologians rather than council fathers, suggests that its teachings represent non-infallible popular opinions, Vatican II's explicit refusal to issue new doctrinal pronouncements seems to imply a similar status. However, Vatican II's theological opinions were not those of mere theologians. Its documents were almost unanimously approved by council fathers. The theological opinions expressed in Lumen Gentium were so widely shared by bishops across the entire world that they may constitute the closest expression of the universal ordinary magisterium that the Church has ever seen. Furthermore, Lumen Gentium's status as a dogmatic constitution, coupled with the magisterium's refusal to draw a sharp distinction between the council's pastoral and doctrinal aims, gives it a weight that transcends a mere theological opinion. Finally, it has also been demonstrated that taking Cantate Domino's formulation of no salvation outside the Church as infallible proves to be problematic, since that would imply the infallibility of its other pronouncements, such as its condemnation of circumcision, and the matter of holy orders being the handing of the paten and chalice. Therefore, while both councils may technically represent theological opinions, the origin of these theological opinions impacts their level of authority. Even if it can be demonstrated that both documents are theological opinions, there is no discontinuity since theological opinions are allowed to change over time. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that there is discontinuity between the two documents. Number 3. Intention. Do they both intend on commenting on the same issue? This is arguably where the councils start to more clearly diverge. As detailed in Episode 3's historical overview, Cantate Domino was concerned with establishing unity between Western and Coptic Christian communities. Its method for doing this was in hastily written papal bulls, whose authors did not intend on constructing a thorough theology of other religions. Nor did its council fathers intend on making any solemn pronouncements on the matter. As Francis Sullivan and Piet Franssen emphasize, a council can only define what it intends to define. Vatican II, on the other hand, clearly intended to develop a robust theology of other religions, specifically regarding their relationship to the Catholic Church. Given their different intentions, there is no contradiction between Cantate Domino and Lumen Gentium's theology of other religions. If anything, the former hardly addresses the matter of other religions, whereas the latter represent the Church's most thorough attempt to address the topic and should, therefore, be much more highly respected. Number 4. Assumptions. Do they share similar epistemological or historical assumptions? The change in assumptions between the councils can be explained by the theology of other religions of the Church Fathers. Early theologians like Justin Martyr believed in salvation beyond the visible church through Christ as logos, or universal wisdom, for people who had never heard the gospel. However, upon their exposure to the gospel, they needed to convert, lest they commit what Aquinas would later consider to be the sin of infidelity. By the Middle Ages, even the most learned theologians, such as Aquinas, believed that the gospel had indeed been preached throughout the world, meaning that those who did not accept the gospel had committed the sin of infidelity. The colonial era, however, not only proved this assumption false, but it demonstrated how preaching the gospel poorly or uncharitably could repel people from the faith. By the time of the Second Vatican Council, given advances in interreligious dialogue and the horrors of intolerance displayed by Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, the Church rediscovered how other religions participate in Christ as universal logos. Protestantism's loosening of Catholicism's grip over evangelization further complicated the clarity of evangelization, since today different denominations and sects can spread very different sounding gospel messages. The difference in historical assumptions between Florence and Vatican II so greatly impacts their commentary on other religions that it significantly alleviates the accusation of discontinuity between them. Number 5. Scope. Do they address the same audience? Cantate Domino was directed at Coptic Christians. Its teaching specifically concerns their beliefs and practices, such as circumcision. Vatican II, on the other hand, was not only directed toward the entire Church, but many of its documents were addressed at the entire world. It is not concerned with one historical event or culture, like the Council of Florence was. Rather, it was an attempt to synthesize a significant amount of Roman Catholic theology for the sake of shepherding its flock. Even if it could be argued that Cantate Domino was meant to provide Roman Catholics with some catechesis, the word permanserit, or that those who failed to persevere in the Catholic Church, implies that it addresses only Easterners who sought to deny Roman authority rather than people born into Jewish or pagan religions. Essentially, it's targeted at people considered leaving the Church rather than people who were never part of it to begin with. Meanwhile, Lumen Gentium speaks about people who are born into other religions rather than simply those who decide to leave the Church. Thus, Florence's scope is arguably limited to the Eastern churches it addresses and perhaps Christians considering leaving the Church, whereas Lumen Gentium and its contemporary documents were clearly directed to the entire Church and non-Christians. The difference in scope also refutes accusations of discontinuity. Number 6. Reception of statement. How were they both received by the magisterium? The reception of each statement exposes a glaring discrepancy between them. Not only was Florence as a whole rejected by Eastern Christianity, but its expression of no salvation outside the Church was soundly rejected by Western theologians in the age of colonization, barely a century after the council closed. It is telling that the rejections of its expression of no salvation outside the Church were not limited to a fringe group during a time in which magisterial dissent was far less tolerated than it is now, but were publicly stated by well-respected theologians. In the following centuries, magisterial authorities themselves, from Pope Alexander VIII's condemnations of Jansenism to the 1949 Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's refutation of Leonard Feeney, rebuked an exclusivist interpretation of no salvation outside the Church. Vatican II's theology of other religions, on the other hand, has not only been defended by subsequent popes of very different theological backgrounds, but attempts to circumvent such ideas have been rejected by formal magisterial authorities. The non-reception of Florence's no salvation expression deals a great blow to Lumen Gentium's alleged discontinuity. Number 7. Relation to other statements. Does Lumen Gentium reject teachings that Cantate Domino was dependent on? Finally, the Florentine expression of no salvation outside the Church was heavily modified by pre-existing theological ideas such as baptism by desire, invincible ignorance, God's authority beyond the visible sacraments, and a difference in moral weight between those who had not reached the age of reason and those who had. Since Florence does not operate in a theological vacuum, it must be read in tandem with these already established and respected doctrines, even if it did not express them in its text. For example, no good Florentine theologian would have denied God's ability to dispense grace beyond his visible sacraments. Ironically, Vatican II, by appealing to St. Thomas Aquinas, articulates the medieval theology of Florence's time more comprehensively than Florence itself did. Thus, when Florence is taken into account in tandem with its contemporary theology, the alleged contradictions between it and Vatican II seem to completely disappear. This episode has compared the source, type, intention, assumptions, scope, reception, and contemporary doctrines of Cantate Domino from the Council of Florence and Lumen Gentium from the Second Vatican Council. Though they were approved by councils, only the latter was written by council fathers. Only one of the documents is conciliar in the fullest sense of the term, so there is arguably no discontinuity in this respect. Though both involved theological opinions, the latter's opinion was universally held by the bishops, suggesting the infallible authority of the universal ordinary magisterium. There is arguably no discontinuity here either. Whereas the preceding conclusions may seem debatable, the following shed more certainty on the matter. Each conciliar document has a fundamentally different intention, the former focusing on Christian unity with the East, not formally commenting on the subject of other religions, and the latter systematically and thoroughly commenting on the matter. Given their different intentions, there is clearly no contradiction here. The assumptions each council make are also starkly different. The former assumes that its audience has no excuse to leave the visible church because the gospel has been thoroughly embedded into society. The latter, on the other hand, addresses a post-Christendom world and recognizes the value other religions can serve as preparation for Christ. There is no discontinuity here either. Florence's scope is confined to the Coptic Christian audiences, and its expression of no salvation outside the Church is arguably directed at Christians who are considering leaving the Church. Lumen Gentium is addressed to the universal Church as well as non-Christians. Thus, the differences in scope also signify no discontinuity. Florence's expression of no salvation outside the Church was soundly rejected by both theological and magisterial authorities, whereas Vatican II's has so far been staunchly defended. There is no discontinuity here. Finally, the theological beliefs, like invincible ignorance, that the Florentine Fathers believed in, even if Cantate Domino did not acknowledge them, are invoked by Lumen Gentium, which demonstrates continuity between their theologies. 6 out of these 7 criteria were clearly rejected, while the other 2 were likely and arguably rejected. Therefore, not just one, but all of these criteria undermine any claims of discontinuity between these two councils. Next episode, we will talk about the significance of Vatican II's continuity with the Council of Florence, and what this demonstration of Vatican II's continuity in its theology of other religions might suggest for other controversial documents that the Council commented on. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.